So welcome everyone to another in our webinar series for Transforming Assessment. And today we're going to hear from Associate Professor Shane Dawson from the University of South Australia and his colleague, who won't be presenting tonight, but his colleague in this area is Professor Martin de Laat from the Open University in the Netherlands. And Shane will no doubt introduce himself in a bit more detail. So I'll just say that what we're going to hear about tonight, or today, wherever you are in the world, is promoting and assessing learning networks, transitioning students to an emerging profession. So I'll hand that over to you, Shane.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thank you very much, Matthew, for talking me into this session. No money was exchanged hands at this stage. We'll see how it goes. I'm sorry to say that Martin de Laat, the lure of the Flinders Ranges was too strong, and he's taken off with his family for a few days, but he did help out on the slides here, and I'll try and interpret some of his work, and hopefully I'll do that well. If not, we'll just put it down to Martin's poor communication skills and dodgy research methodologies. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along. I'm happy to try and address them as we go. It is probably a little bit different from what I understand some of the other talks around that have occurred through the Transforming Assessment webinars. What we really want to do here is try and take a very broad view of what assessment is and look at it in terms of the education system, 21st century literacies, but also looking at it in terms of the impact of social rooms and social learning. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go through. So as just a quick overview, what we want to do is just have a very brief discussion around how things are moving from education system to a learning society, which is nothing new. I want to just clarify 21st century literacies and the role of social learning in that discussion. The development of user collaborative spaces, and I have the UniSA here, was just released their fancy new building, and I'll just do a little quick talk about that. And then how we've built and designed these formal, informal and professional spaces, but really how do we actually start to assess these? How do we assess more than snapshots of learning we'll talk about and go into the process, and using networks about that. Then I want to draw on three tools, which is kind of the crux of where we want to get to and why these tools came about, and namely SNAPP as an assessment of formal practice, Martin's tool, which is why we get along so well, he likes networks as well, which is called the Network Awareness Tool, and a case study that he's undertaken. A new tool that Martin and I are now developing called NetMap, but I'd also like to get your feedback. It's a shocking name, and Martin came up with it. I had absolutely nothing to do with it. But whether we should call it something like Study Buddy or Study Mate, that'll make sense more when we talk it. And then I believe Matt and Jeff have promised beer and cookies at the end of this for everyone, so as a final part. So that will be lovely. I'm drinking one right now. It's quite refreshing. Okay, so education now, where we're at. We know Erica Williams talks about education being more important than ever, but less relevant than ever, and that's really where we're at. The OECD reports and everything will tell us that education is extremely important in terms of health, employment, income, the increased chance of re-engagement through industries and work industries, and also greater community infrastructure as a result of a greater educated population. But at the same time, we also have education that's been less relevant than ever, so where things are credentials are sort of tick the box items, where creative capital is actually seen to be worth more. I think that was well illustrated in the Wellington Ascalite discussion, where we had one of the students talk about why do we actually go through education now, and a lot more can be developed through creative capital and also through peer and industry networks and the development of those networks and entrepreneurial skills. So the 21st century, it's very quick, but to wrap it all up there, 21st century needs more than routine thinking. We need to build into things that Dan Pink now calls curation. There's a buoyancy and an incubation phase as well. Yep. So we need new models, and we haven't really jumped across into these, although as one of the comments went through, we are sort of 14 years into the new century. We haven't actually changed the way their education models function. So we are now, and I think the explosion of MOOCs has sort of forced this a little bit, but looking at the creation of a lifelong learning infrastructure where we're creating and cultivating and embracing new learning providers. It's not just seen as the university sector or colleges. We're looking at new ways to recognise and assess and validate knowledge and skills. Sorry about the phone call there. Assess new knowledge and skills, but we're also looking at, that's obviously through MOOCs and edX, Coursera, Udacity and others, but also a lot of the private providers and also the work experience based ones. So we need, associated with that, there's a lot of conversations now going back to looking at competencies. And so I didn't think I'd ever live to see competencies come back in as being an educational conversation, but there it is. So we're back into how do we actually now measure competencies and break up our university or our curriculum programs into these static bases, these skill-based aspects, where people can now challenge for assessment. So literally, you know, why does it take 13 weeks to run through a semester associated with a set level of credits, where you can literally say, look, I think I've got those skills and attributes and knowledge now, just give me all the exams and I'll do it now within 15 minutes. And of course, I only want to pay half of the course fees for being able to do that. So which then leads to support for alternate multiple pathways to learning that are formal, non-formal and informal. So models that begin to foster the development of these 21st century skills. So what are 21st century literacies? And there's 1,000,001 definitions that and frameworks. For example, you can go and see the P21 or Henry Jenkins' participatory culture. But a lot of the commonalities through these around what they call the 7 Cs of 21st century. Critical thinking, communication, collaboration, network agility, IT media skills, creativity, and lifelong learning skills. What about cider and wine drinkers? Definitely. And all of these are building on the traditional literacies as a sound framework and basis. So the traditional pedagogical models, there's strong consensus to this, that they're not going to develop those skills. They don't develop network agility. They don't necessarily develop critical thinking, collaboration, and so on. So we've seen a shift around traditional learning theory now into what we're calling a social learning theory, and where thinking happens from in the head to interactions with the world, where the unit of analysis, especially around aspects of creativity and measuring creativity, is no longer linked with the individual but as a community aspect. And the measurement and focus is where I'm particularly interested now, is moving away from outcomes into the process of learning. How learning happens is obviously around knowledge construction, and Lou now of the thoughts of previous thoughts around transmission of information. So these 21st century literacies, trying to build all this together and where we're going around this conversation is, they're developed through these social pedagogies, they're supported by technology, and they're facilitated by these collaborative learning spaces, which obviously occur in formal spaces or informal spaces in industry and external to the universities. And I think that's a lovely little cartoon there. So around the new next generation learning spaces, Radcliffe and others did, I think it was through an ALTC or RLT funded project, but this notion around the PST, the pedagogy, influencing technology and vice versa, and having a space and so forth, all being interactive and feeding off one another. So that the new models of classroom architecture were seen to be technology rich, collaborative rich, and importantly flexible and adaptive to support these different spaces and different models of learning that we wanted to employ. So that they, at the same time, because they have these flexibilities and technology integrations, but they do provide for new metrics and analytics. So we can actually move from now a snapshot of the learning process, which might have been seen as an assessment piece at a particular point in time, towards more of a longitudinal process of learning and doing it in that way. So this is one of the collaborative spaces. So I want to talk more, just a little bit as we touched on. So when we talk about the 3 tools, why actually why I'm showing you this bit was Martin de Laat was actually brought over from the University of Netherlands, and part of his role here, part of the project we came up with is how do you actually evaluate process of learning, and how do you actually evaluate the space that supports along with the pedagogy that's employed in the curriculum structure. So the University of South Australia built this beautiful building, all minus the jacaranda, or we do have a jacaranda, but it doesn't look as impressive as that. But this new building popped up, and it was designed around informal, formal learning spaces and bringing in industry engagement. So the three aspects we'll touch on in a minute. It's very impressive. Looks great. And you can see this was taken literally from one of the design documents of how it wanted to they wanted to see the building, how it wanted to operate, which is very well, it's pretty much taken from Radcliffe's work, where the pedagogy, but also the integrated services and support of student learning is all blended in with the space and the technology. So it has what Margaret Hicks has been talking about, is these integrated services which cut across every single floor of that building. So regardless of where students are, they can engage with others in informal and formal contexts, but they can also receive support through technology, the space in that area, but also the administration of that area. So this building was designed for the student, integrated services, a merge of formal and informal contexts, and particularly for UniSA, we wanted to build in stronger connections with the community and industry, which led to a lot of questions about how do we actually evaluate that. So here's just I'm going to step through this really quickly, so bear with me, stick with me. Here was one of the ground floors, and one of the key aspects there is this galleon, this professional space where we wanted to bring in industry aspects to it. And it came in, it basically looks like this, where there's a foyer area there. There's a dirty great big screen behind the students at the present, it's out of that picture. But it was an area where we could have industry set up, do displays, talk about areas, more open forums, opportunities to ask about careers and jobs, and also opportunities for people, for instance, mobile developers or web developers to come in and show their wares and get feedback. The informal spaces, and we have, this is where we'll be evaluating with one of the tools I'll talk about later, was for more informal social learning spaces. So there's a cafe here. There's an opportunity for students to come together out of a formal space and into these informal areas. And that was one of the key questions that drove Martin and I together was, does a formal curriculum process lead to informal connections? Does the building support those connections in a particular way? And obviously we have a formal space, which is not going to be too different to what a lot of universities are now building, where you have these wonderful little round tables where everything's technology rich and connected. You can control the room in various ways, and if the students aren't paying attention, a hand comes out and slaps and it pops out of the middle of the desk. It's fantastic. It's good for group work as well. So these spaces all gave opportunities, new opportunities to unbundle and reconfigure how and where learning happens. We can support learning in the new emerging context through social media spaces and the informal spaces. Our pedagogy now can be designed for high performance, can be more personalised, and we can support the learning and skills necessary for the 21st century. It becomes more learner controlled and focused, and obviously becomes more supportive of a networked approach to learning. So, but the question then is, how the hell do you go around assessing these aspects? How do you assess, for instance, student transitions from formal spaces to informal learning? How do you capture when someone is actually learning and not just having a chat about virtual beers and so forth? How do you actually capture network agility and measure sort of that your curriculum supports that, supports collaboration and creativity, or promotes access to networks that extend beyond these classroom structures and start to bridge into professional networks? So we wanted to move from these snapshots to process. So we have new forms of data that can assess, poorly spelling error on the slide, but new forms of data that we can start to use to assess engagement. We can, through the pedagogy, we can look at learning activities and the intended outcomes, what's the context and intent, and we have assistance with most universities now through the regulation process will have some capture of that. We have various technologies in the classrooms where we can look at user logs, through the learning management system, through gaming processes, through resource accesses, through libraries, or even just through clicker interactions in classroom activity. And then we have the space itself, where we can look at Wi-Fi data and the level of building access, occupancy rates, and so on. So how do we go about it? Well, Martin and I, again, were sort of drawn to networks, so that was the obvious space for us to start to look at how we could evaluate these areas and those questions, and had a look at networks. So we wanted to assess student network agility and creativity in the use of space, and the professional development needs and the types of learner roles that emerge through these networks using various tools and data. So just so we're on a common understanding before we get into the three tools and the actual case studies there, I'll just briefly touch on social network analysis. And just below there, we have a lovely, well thought out sociogram where each of the circles represents an actor or a node. Each of the lines then represents a relationship that's been formed. So that might be communication has passed, or it could be delivery of a package, it could be some information flow. And the whole collective of it then becomes a network. So it's obviously based on graph theory and so on. So how do you interpret these visualizations? So once you start getting to a richer element, obviously a little bit more dense than something like this, and you look at a social network such as this one, we can start to look at some centrality aspects such as betweenness, or what Ron Burt calls the broker, where if you took that node out, we would obviously end up with three separate clusters. So they bridge what he terms as a structural whole, which have, and these types of individuals have very specific characteristics and very specific skills and attributes. They also, in terms of information flow, they're connected into different camps of information where they can access that. So they become very interesting folks. Degree is another important one, and depending on which way you view information flows, and especially when you're looking at things like discussion forums and people replying to an individual, or you're looking at author citation networks and so on, you can sort of interpret in degrees and out degrees differently. But degrees essentially is the number of connections for a node. So this particular node here that I've highlighted has 7 other connections. I hope I counted that right. 1, 2, 5. No, 6. After long and arduous checking, the degree there should be 6, and none of you picked it up. Barney Delgado, I notice, is there. Barney, help me out. So the in degree is literally then who is actually talking to that individual. The out degree is who are they actually talking to. So you can see information flow. So when you look at large networks, in degree and out degree becomes very important, where you see students who ask questions, and so, or students who respond to lots of questions. So you can see who initiates threads or not based on network structures. This is a little interesting cluster here, where you can see the darker the line illustrates the strength of the tie. So the thicker it is, the darker it is, the stronger the tie that's being built up there. So this, obviously, when you see a cluster like this where students are tightly packed or actors are tightly packed together, it really indicates that it's trust building. There's a lot of connections being built there. Generally, it starts off as like flocks to like or homophilic clustering. But they're founded on strong ties and very trust and community-driven networks. So, any questions just quickly about, I know it was a very brief summary of social networks, but feel free to ask more. But I'll just pause for just a minute to see if anyone has any questions about social network analysis, because the 3 tools that we talk about next will really start to flesh that out a little bit more. I'll just pause for 30 seconds now while I'm rambling on.
So you can either type in your questions, or you can put your hand up if you want to take the mic.
Wonderful. I will assume that the articulation of social network analysis 101 here has been brilliant. Kirsten, all online data are also in spaces you showed. At the moment, they've just been made up, but what will come through will be online data. and offline data, so in other spaces when we work with NAT, the Network Awareness Tool. Yep, that's a good question, Barney, and I'm actually going to show a slide there where there were literally thousands of students, not hundreds, and a way in which you can start to do those interpretations there, so good question. Okay. That's a good question, Jenny. You don't. It depends. It depends on the artifact of the relationship. So it's a really good question. So part of it where they are joined, it could be just around disagreement. So you end up there. Disagreement. It depends if you're looking at it over time or as a snapshot. So over time, you actually see disagreement and people filter out from one another after there's a flaming event. But if it's built up, generally, as in this case, I've just made these diagrams up just to illustrate what trust looks like. You can also look at the elements there of what is the conversation that's gone on, or what is oh, thank you, Karen, sorry. The question there was, in the close connections, how do you know it is trust and not disagreement or hate? So literally, yeah, it'd be looking at the qualitative elements there. And so you can actually just use this as a way of drilling down. And I'll talk about SNAPP as one way of doing that, but obviously Martin also has an approach to do that as well. So, you're welcome, Jim. So SNAPP was a tool that we started off 100 years ago. It's almost as big as Twitter at the moment. It's leaping off. We're going to publicly float it. So if people are interested, stay aware, there's shares you can buy. So it stands for Social Networks Adapting Pedagogical Practice, and it was a way in which we wanted to get very quickly into the social side of learning and being able to visualize that. So we wanted to look at, in the learning management system, the discussion forum activity, and it's something that made more sense to faculty, to teachers, something that they could visualize rather than just a huge threaded element that on a screen. So we did focus on specifically those student relationships and looking at the social collaborations that go on in that way. We wanted simple visualizations to assist with the interpretation and evaluate the impact of activity. So if you're trying to develop, we had a lot of faculty when we first started talking about sense of community or communities of practice or learning communities. But the only way that was sort of evaluated was to look at a thread count. So I had, every student made a post, therefore I had community. So we wanted to look at whether or not there was a better way of doing that, and that's literally where SNAPP formed from. We couldn't, in the first instance of SNAPP, we couldn't actually tap into the database. So my colleague Anisha Bakari, who's absolute genius, came up with the idea of a bookmarklet, which is just basically how you add a favorite on a page, and then it runs a JavaScript element, and then unpacks the relationships that are on that page. So it literally skins the page for HTML and looks at the relationships being built. One of the positives of that, at the time we found it extremely frustrating, but one of the positives was that how quick and easy it was for dissemination. So literally, man, if you have the technical skills to add a favorite, you've got the technical skills to run SNAPP. And there's a link there which I see Jeff added in previously as well, to go to SNAPP. It's free, download it, knock yourselves out. Coming up, there has been a group from Marist in the States, Marist College in the States, who have built they're associated with the Sakai Foundation. They've built an actual plugin for SNAPP, and we are currently working on a Moodle plugin version for that as well. So it'll be a little bit SNAPP heavy, if you like. It will plug into the database, but it'll be ported in as a LTI, a better integration process. Stay tuned. Hopefully done this year. So this was just an example of a discussion forum. This was WebCT, but Blackboard's pretty similar, where you would get something like this, where threaded discussion, and we tried to transform it into something like this, where you could see then the relationships that were built up around individuals, who was connected to who and who was replying and so on. In this case, we've taken the names off the individuals, but you would also see names there. And you could also highlight the ego network and have a look at who people were connected to, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that was one way. So to address one of the questions earlier, I think, Jenny, you could then quickly drill in if there was a close connection or a cluster of a group there that you wanted to look at. You could actually then pop in and see who those individuals were and then just pop back literally and just have a look for their name in one of these areas and see what the discussion was about. And you would see threaded lots of replies to replies to replies, so it was quite deep structure. SNAPP also gives a set of statistics, so you can actually run some analyses. And there was a filtering function as well, so you could see the network over a period of time and so on. There was also a bit of an annotation layout, so you could see the frequency of activity that would happen over the course of a teaching course over a semester. And also you could make your own annotation. So literally the goal of it there was to understand and evaluate your impact. So if you were not getting a network structure, if you're trying to build community and you see a very sparse network, something like this where you've got a central node and everyone answering a central node. Obviously, in this case, a teacher's asked a question and everyone's responded to that. If you're trying to build community, you'd be looking for a lot of increased connections among the other nodes to look something like, oops, sorry, not yet. To have a lot more cross-clustered, lot tighter cluster and a denser network structure then. Here's just another example where you've got two forums and trying to just quickly show the impact of the evaluations and then the interpretations that might go back to a lecturer. Forum 1, you've got a network driven by one individual. Forum 2, you've got 3 separate clusters forming. So it could be group work, and that might be something you like. Alternatively, you might be looking now, how do I bridge those, form tighter connections between those 3 separate groups. No. I'll talk about close, sorry, Sally asked a question there. Is a close connection just one with lots of conversation between people? No, it can be a close connection. The way I refer to it is either close in terms of the center of the network, so something like this. And also, or it could be a separate cluster, but people are quite close to each other in terms of they're having a deep conversation. There's a lot of connectivity there. So here's one out of, so to get to Barney asked a question, what do you do about thousands of students? Here's a way of visualizing that. This came out of a class of just over 1,000, I think 1,200 students accessing a forum, and we visualized it. And it was really trying to understand what happens in these forums when you get something like this. Now the main nodes there, I don't know, Jeff, can I just ask a quick question on that? Can you see my mouse, or maybe I'll do a drawing feature?
Actually here, you can use the little toolbar. I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen. There is a highlighter function or such things that you can scribble on the screen with. Or there's a virtual arrow button there. Looks like a star shape that you can change it to an arrow, if that's what you want. Sorry, continue.
Aha, how's that?
Yep, that's got it.
Yep, okay, fantastic. So there's, you can see 3 dominant nodes here that are starting to, sort of lots of in degrees happening there, lots of out degrees, talking to lots of individuals. I'll get to that one in a second, Barney. So these 3 individuals here, 2 of them were TAs. So interestingly, it was a way in which the instructor wanted to evaluate the impact of TAs. But also this individual here, who's the main one, was a student, which was very interesting there. In terms of where, if you've got a large class, where do we start to pay attention? This was an interesting study in looking at, you've got a set of outliers here, students who have made a post that don't actually get any response. We found through earlier work that students who actually make a post and make an effort but don't receive any reply are often searching for individuals, searching for either an academic response or want to fit into a particular group through a social message, and neither is working. So they get very frustrated, and they're generally the most dissatisfied with their course. So they'll give you kind of the spanking on the CEQs, the course experience surveys that are offered, or student evaluations of teaching. The other aspect, which may touch into, Barney, your question there around characterising students according to behaviour, not quite, is to actually look at the ego networks. So what we did in this case is just an example ego network of one of the students with a high performing network. I'll get rid of that arrow once you've got it. As a high performing network, and in this case you can see the individuals, this individual here, their connections are with other high performing students. There's other students who are here, but they have actually quite a high grade as well. They were in the 75 group. Sorry, that's actually on the wrong one. The blue student there, and that arrow is pointing to the wrong one. The blue students here are the low percent students, so who have wandered in. When we looked at the low performing networks, we saw a very contrasting view here where these individuals, the low performers, had very sparse networks. They didn't have a lot of connections, and those connections were not as well connected, I won't say tightly, as well connected as what's shown in this example. And they also only spoke to other low performing students. So students sort of had this mechanism of self-selecting or self-regulating who they'll participate with in their own network structure. And as you build them all together, it actually forms something like this. Okay, so that was literally a sort of a quick overview of SNAPP and sort of one of the projects we've looked at. Kim, I'll get to your question in a second as well, and these are good questions. So what about trying to look at some of the elements that we spoke about first about being in this 21st century literacies? I mean, it's nice to look at it and base it. I mean, most learning analytics work comes back to performance, which is then a sort of a graded component of what occurs in assessment. But can we actually develop other aspects of looking at things like network agility or assessing creative capacity? So in this case, as I mentioned, Ronald Burt has a great paper there, Structural Holes and Good Ideas, if you're interested in this area. But what Ron talks about is a study he performed looking at people who form this brokering role. So literally, if that node was not there, you would end up with two separate clusters. And what he found was that these individuals are seen as the creative types in an organization. They see information earlier, they're in great positions to receive that information earlier. But as one component, as one cluster here, solve a particular problem, these brokers do a transforming role, and they can then provide a solution to this cluster. And so they're seen as the people who bring ideas, they're seen as the people who are quite creative in an organization. So we wanted to look at the same process in higher education. Could we look at this in medical education and see whether the students who played these brokering roles in a network, were they the creative individuals? Did they have these creative attributes? So we took some work from Jen Paling Tan, from her PhD, Digital Kids Analog Students, and she had a really great, basically a self-report survey looking at student cognitive playfulness and creativity, and then we took those surveys and mapped them back into the centrality measures around betweenness, closeness and degrees. The nice thing there was, just very briefly, it's been published and you're happy to give you directions to that paper, but basically the students there who did fill, and you see the blue colouring here, who filled these brokering roles were the higher students with the self-reported, though, notions of creativity. The next step then was for us to look at creative capacity then as a transferable skill. So if we looked at it in this context of being able to say, okay, we can map through and see aspects or attributes that would lend themselves to creative capacity and students to have those skills, are they transferable? So if we have the notion of Erica's work, in Erica McWilliams' work, of building creative capacity and pedagogical models to go along with that, could we actually then see that as a transferable skill that flowed into industry? So were they creative nodes in higher education, in the class setting? Did they have that transfer into professional setting? And what were the actors then? What are they working on? Can we define those network relationships where this started to occur? So I'll just pause there for a second And Kim had a question there. I'm wondering that if the nature content of the interaction is part of the analysis, as at the end of the day, it is the quality of the interaction that decides what learning occurs. That's a damn good question, as Simon noted. For me, at this particular point in time, when I'm looking at a network such as this one, I'm not overly concerned as to what the connection that's been made there, because there has been a connection. There's some form of engagement, so that's the first step. If I want students to start the learning process, the social learning process, they have to at least have put their hand up and made a connection with someone, and it shows largely that that has occurred. I'd be more interested in these individuals as to why they're not, and that's where I would look at. So if you've got a large class, it sort of gives an indication of where to hone in. That's not fully answers your question, but it does lead nicely into Martin's work, where he has what he termed as the network awareness tool. And this was literally a process where you do capture the quality of the conversation, what is the conversation about, along with the who people are talking to in the relationships, who's engaged in that particular part of a conversation. So what Nat, actually, here's just a screen grab of Nat, and what it actually does is users would create a topic of conversation that they wanted to do. Then as people engaged in that area, you could see, if you select innovation management, who was engaged in a conversation around innovation management. So you actually started to bring in some of the quality aspects there. Anisha Bakkaria's PhD work in machine learning, this is sort of an area for SNAPP, and where we wanted to move into was also to look at the qualitative aspect. How can we do some semantic analysis to get a richer context of it? But Martin's has a manual process at this stage. We need to look at how we could automate that through some of the social engagements that happen in our learning management systems. So the other part of NAT is you can also see you have attributes which are not just classified then as a student, but here you can classify them in different ways. And in this case, they've classified them around an organization. So by selecting demonstration organization, my Dutch is extremely good. You can actually then see who are the networks there, and you can see that this individual here is not tied in, even though they're all the same in the same organization. They have not participated, not connected to this part of the network. So Martin undertook, NAT was really to look at the hidden informal professional development networks in organizations. He wanted to understand the emergent professional network structures and dynamics. So this is again moving away from that formal context into the informal and professional mode, and study professional participation that occurs in emerging learning topics that were user defined. So the individuals created these topics, and in this case it was a study across the Netherlands, looking at 8 schools, across 8 schools, and 136 teachers participating in that, with using NAT to map and visualize the networks. They identified 72 topics, which were then looking at the other one became, I'll just classify that, 72 characteristics such as here, that then formed these individual networks of who were associated in that space. They could then identify what needs in discussion are important for their professional development. So you actually had that qualitative element that fed into this process. So just to understand the emergent professional network and structures was their goal. Looking at a topic such as cooperative learning, you then get a density feature around that. In this case, it was 0.062. So 19 ties out of 306 possible ties. We're talking about cooperative learning, which is very low. But if it was a network, if it was a density of 1, it means every single individual was conversing in that one topic. And the nice thing about that, though, is if every single individual was talking about cooperative learning, for instance, it means it's a pretty important area that as a professional development area that may want to be investigated further. So it does give you a relative importance of the topic in the context of all other topics, so you can get a ranking could actually be formed there. So you can understand the network structures and dynamics that actually occur. So again, using cooperative learning, you can look at the interaction patterns based on in degree and out degree. So you can see who's reaching out and looking for help and who's responding. So you actually start to get notions of learning roles. So who are the experts or specialists in this area that can actually help out others in a network? Who might be experts in a particular area around cooperative learning, or who might be an expert in an assessment processes for collaboration and so on? And who are the individuals, importantly, seeking help in that area that might require it? The other interesting areas that, and I'm sure Martin did this because I'm colorblind, so literally the yellow and green look exactly the same to me, but he has assured me they're different. I'm waiting to see whether or not this is true. But the node color represents a school, so you can actually see that there's 4 disconnected networks here, with 2 in the one school. So while we have, again, a colored node, someone from one school talking to another person in another school, we're getting some cross-school collaboration. We also have a separate group out here, but they're at least connected. And in here we have one school, the same organization, the same group, but they're disconnected networks. So it might be a way in which you could jump in and start to bridge those gaps there. So with that, a lot of emerging professional development, but in this case, the teaching networks were small and localized. It was a way in which you could start to assess professional development and the quality aspect of the professional development through network learning. Used as a process for determining and assessing their professional needs. And it can also be used to assess a teacher's network agility and a collaborative skills. So how are we, as emergent professionals, as students who are coming from an education degree, how are they going into their yeah, there is, Matt. I'll have to chase it up, sorry. There is a link to that which I'll try and put up, or at least send out, and so you can put it on the site later. How do these students then go into their professional degree? How quickly can they integrate into that? How quickly can they actually start to develop their own networks there? The last tool that I want to quickly touch on, just recognizing time as well, I'm going to leave some for questions before everyone bails out, is NetMap, or just keep in mind, we'll just do a little poll at the end whether it should be called Study Buddy or Study Mate. This is really a mobile application that was designed to map informal networks that move out of that University of South Australia building and that we raised before. So as they come out of a formal space and go into informal spaces, or just the design of the informal space itself, can we start to see what the learning ties happen, and can we actually build this so that students have access to the surrounding and available social capital? So the notion there also was that if you're in a cohort, a student, we go through year 1, 2, 3, and 4, sometimes 5, 6, depending on the student, but you're structured in a horizontal layer, and we wanted to try and break that so that not only you could look at vertical aspects of your discipline and try and tap into networks that are associated in a vertical layer, but branch out of your discipline and look at other areas. So the easy one to think about there is trying to get help. If you're a health student and you need some help on statistics, why wouldn't you have access to someone who's in 2nd or 3rd year maths to come and give you a hand there? So this is what the tool looks like, and we've got Nisha's helping us out on that, but it was literally a mobile application, and what it did is you logged in and it would come up and then say, okay, it's got anonymous here, this is this lady here, but this is what I'll be working on, ABC 1, 2, 3. It could also bring in, depending on how students want to put up, some of the skills that you would have, and you can search based on skills, location, and people. And what they're working on. So if there are other people in the building working on ABC 1, 2, 3, or someone who's done ABC 1, 2, 3, this student here would be able to see them if they've logged into NetMap. This was one of the search mechanisms, just to illustrate this further, was that find students studying near you. This might be just a tag cloud looking at different larger the word, the more students that have indicated that this is what they're working on, or this is the skill that they may have. And we can see here that just in the back there might be a student saying, I'm studying SNA. So it's kind of a way in which students could rapidly visualize what's happening in these spaces there. So this one is, just to finish this one up, because it doesn't really talk about what we've done because we've got no data on that yet, but this is literally what we'll do now is trial this in that space. The tool has been developed. We'll throw it across to the kids and see how they interact with this tool, and whether or not, how they, based on the locality, then when we look at students who are talking to one another, if you look at these two students here, can we presume that they are having a conversation about with one another that is a learning context, which I think taps on one of Jenny's comments earlier. So part of it will be at the end of as you log out of NetMap or after a period of time when we kick you out. We don't want to follow students all around Adelaide. It'll ask them, here was a list of students that were in that same vicinity as you. Did you actually talk to them? If so, what was it about? Yeah, so Lindy, that's a really cool one. There is a tool called Social Radar, and I have a colleague, it's developed I think by Michael Chasen, who's ex-Blackboard. I have a colleague who's been doing the programming on that, which literally does that, where when you walk into a room, almost you could see, Shane, and then if I'm logged in, it gives you all the networks that are associated with me in terms of LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. And so you can see how many nodes you are away from that person or who you may have in common. That's it, yeah, it's very cool. So, and it was, this idea came from Martin and I were sort of trying to work this out. And then there's another area which called Seats to Meet, which is operates in the Netherlands, and it's an idea where you can actually, if you get a free room, you can have access to people's social capital. It's this trade-off. Yeah, it would be nice to get some of that offline activity, but so that's literally, Barney, why we want to ask them whether or not they did talk about these aspects. It is a privacy issue, which is why we ask the students if they want to log in here. So if there is an invisibility function as well. So you might want to log in and just lurk, if you like, if we're still using that term, to see who's about if you're looking for help with statistics. But at the same time, you don't have to show where you are. You can actually still use the functionality of the tool without revealing that I am this person's at the back studying SNA. Just to wrap up in the final few minutes, basically it sort of taps into Barney's area about the offline and online, but the complexity of the social process and learning, it won't be adequately accessed through basic metrics such as looking at a quick log on or a time online or clicks or multiple choice exams. We need to have more of a process-oriented view of assessment so that we're actually building learner profiles and building up data sets that actually map across and show changes. So Phil Winnie has a really nice thing called COPES, which is basically looking at sort of the cognitive but the elements in how students engage, but also the evaluation and the scaffolding component, the structures component. So you can actually, if we're using a framework like Phil Winnie's, then you can be able to see aspects of how students are changing their behaviour according to an activity or some sort of external motivation or internal mechanism there. So we looked at, just very quickly, 3 tools to assess, and I wanted to illustrate there was about social learning, it was about the interactions and the multi-literacies, and we looked at SNAPP, which is in the formal context of which you could start to look at network agility, and especially here where we did a study on creativity and mapping creativity. Martin's tool and his work looking at professional networks and agility and lifelong learning, how people are actually building that up again in a process view, and NetMap, and just do a little stop. Should it be called NetMap, Study Buddy or Study Mate? Which will be the process we'll be able to sort of have a look at informal learning, at least the connections there, the students around that space. Are they actually forming connections as a result of the social learning spaces we've established and designed, and that's what we wanted to do. Learning analytics, which is basically I'll jump over that, but learning analytics, much potential for merging these methodologies, SNA, with others that sort of look at automated approaches to qualitative analyses, where you can start to look at the learning as a process and little snapshots, and getting towards building learning profiles, which is definitely an area that we'll start to hear more of over the next few years, where we have individual learning profiles and demonstrations of those profiles against set attributes and competencies and assessment measures. I think that's pretty much it for me. I'm sure there's a million and one questions in the remaining time, but I'll try and address some as they went through there. I just saw another one. Can social network analysis be applied to face-to-face interactions too, such as placement learning? Yes, it can. There was a study by a Swedish Tony Roxa, who literally went round to look at differences there. It wasn't placement learning, but it gives an example of how that works, where they went around and asked people who do they talk to in terms of their teaching, and who do they talk to academics, and who do they talk to about research, to show the differences in those networks between teaching networks and research networks. At the same time, we've just launched here a professional development intensive program where we're looking at people's attitudes and basically their sentiment to aspects of technology, enhanced learning and blended learning. And then we put them through this program. We see whether their sentiment has changed, but also whether their networks are growing. No, it's Roxa with an A. We look at, we ring up and we ask people, who do you talk to about technology, or who do you talk to about teaching? We map those networks across this organisation, the university, and we go in at least 2 deep. So if someone said, called me up and said, Shane, who do you talk to about your teaching and technology, inclusion of technology in your classroom? I might say it's Jill next door in the room. Then we would call up Jill and ask, who does she talk to? And we go at least 1 deep into that process there. The goal being is once the staff have gone through the program, we want to be able to see what are the connections there. Do people change their connections? Do they change their sentiment? Do they grow their networks? And importantly, do they map networks across their discipline? So it's easier to actually jump in and talk to the person in the room next door. Much harder to go across campus or across the other side of the suburb to talk to someone as well. So we want to see if those connections are formed through this process. I think that's it for me, Matt. You're welcome, Shamini. If there's any other questions, please let me know.
So you can either type in your questions, or you can put your hand up if you want to take the microphone and ask a question, if you want to be brave enough to do that. Okay, Jackie, would you like to take the microphone?
The question, can you say, how are you progressing with that professional development program? Is it having much of an impact? And if your networking analysis showing the power of networks, I'm just wondering how far you're progressing, if you've got time just to share a little bit with the people participating now. I'm sure they're interested.
Jackie, I'm really sorry, but I found it. Sorry, Jackie, I found it really hard to hear your question then. My apologies. Could you
yeah, Jackie, it wasn't clear at all, sorry, for that one. So I'm wondering whether you might want to try and type it in instead, sorry.
I certainly heard the first part, which was how am I going? I'm going pretty good, actually.
Yeah, Jackie's just typing in, you can see.
No worries.
Perhaps while people are typing in, Shane, I might ask a question if that's okay. And really, where do you see this going? Because do you actually see this becoming part of the sort of core business and the core sorts of things we're doing? I mean, one of the things I'm always interested in is, looking at things that are obviously really, great tools, really good ideas, really good ways of doing this. But do you see this sort of approach being embedded at scale and in sort of, the majority of the activities we do, or only in some?
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great question. I think it will go to scale. That's definitely where we're looking at the moment. So there's a lot of areas I didn't mention. I mean, we just sort of focused on networks here, but we're doing a lot on process mining at the moment with Dragan Gasiewicz. It's absolutely fantastic researcher from Canada. And Georg Grossman from UniSA looking at process mining as well. And so I think which probably taps into a little bit of Barney's question as well, but about looking at how students interact across all systems and across area, which then makes it far more scalable, where I would see us heading in students being able to have access to that data, but have access to that data in ways that they can then demonstrate a competency or a progression or learning progression in certain areas. So, or almost as a, if you like, sort of an extension of what the portfolio, is meant to be, where you pull in artifacts to demonstrate a particular, achievement. So, you pull in an essay that you felt was really good because it responded to, your group work or collaboration and so on. I think there'll be other elements here where you'll be looking at all offshoots of data that you're tying into these spaces. In terms of the building and looking at sort of the assessment of buildings, that's a huge area as well, and it's just growing and becoming more and more sophisticated as we go through. Part of it, I mean, there were questions around privacy and things that popped up. That's a huge debate that we're going to have, but definitely looking at aspects of occupancy rates and understanding how buildings being used, where the information flows, the Wi-Fi data, how students log in and where they sit, where do they study, where do they move and their profiles of movement. Just absolutely allows us to personalise things far better.
People may want to type in some more questions and say some things, but just before too many more people go, because I know some people are heading off now, I just want to say thank you very much, Shane. And this has been a really stimulating presentation, because obviously it's got all of us thinking about not only the possibilities of the tools that you spoke of, but also where it all fits in with what we're doing, which, I mean, you saw from a lot of those questions. I think it's really stimulated a lot of thoughts for people. So thanks very much, and also thank you to Martin in his absence as well, and we hope he's doing well in the Flinders Ranges. So thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. We'll stay on for a few more minutes. Shane, if you're still free, because people might have a few more things that they want to ask, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for doing the presentation, and thanks to everyone for participating.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks, Matt, for organising. Thanks for giving us the kick in the bum when you needed to. And hopefully it's not raining on Martin where he is at the moment, but he did a great job in bringing this together. So hopefully it was of use. And if there's any questions or further questions, I'm happy to stick around for a bit longer. Thanks very much.
You can probably stop the recording now, I think, Matthew.